Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Taylor Ward, and I am the Communications and Education Manager at Just Solutions Collective. The Just Solutions Collective identifies and promotes just solutions to climate change from Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and frontline diasporas. And we provide informed analysis and more on the just solutions for an energy future that supports replication of community-developed, equitable, and just solutions. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on FEMA's Equity Action Plan and Authority to Deliver, Insights for Environmental and Climate Justice Advocates. In today's event, we will break down FEMA's recently published Equity Action Plan and explore whether it will achieve equity for BIPOC frontline communities. And the discussion will include advocacy recommendations for how FEMA can better deliver on equity outcomes. And we'll also hear from Cristina Muñoz de la Torre, the Director of Programs Research at Just Solutions Collective, who recently published an analysis of FEMA's Equity Action Plan that we'll share the link to. And we'll also hear from Hannah Perls, staff attorney at Harvard's Environmental and Energy Law Program, who will discuss the extent to which FEMA has the authority to implement and deliver on its equity commitments. After each of their presentations, we'll have about 5 minutes for Q&A from both of them. And then we'll end up the event with a live discussion space featuring some folks on the call who will share their insights and questions they have around this topic. So if you have any questions throughout the event, please feel free to use the Q&A box or also use the chat to share your thoughts. And we are live tweeting throughout this event. So please check out our Twitter at just_solutions. And you can stay up to date on the conversation there and tweet us throughout the event. And with that, I will hand it over to Cristina.
So I will be covering the FEMA's Equity Action Plan. And this report has been published already, so I'll have someone in my team relink the brief in case you haven't had a chance to peruse over it on the chat box. And then my colleague already introduced Just Solutions Collective. This is a cute picture of us. We'll have a newer picture of us, but yeah, like my colleague mentioned, we provide policy and program research and really want to center BIPOC and frontline communities in the work that we do and ensure that we are translating all this information in a way that is accessible and actionable. So with that in mind, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm the Director of Programs Research. I have around 13 years of environmental justice research and advocacy experience. I also have had a background in community-based planning, especially for disaster resilience, and just really been working both in the research and advocacy space. And what I want to cover today is, I forgot to also mention, I'm getting a PhD in basically my dissertation is entirely focused on federal disaster assistance. So how FEMA and HUD distribute disaster aid after disasters to communities and whether they're doing so equitably, who's receiving that assistance, especially if BIPOC and frontline communities are receiving it, and how can we start improving the equitable allocation of disaster assistance. So with that in mind, I wanted to, when I saw that the Equity Action Plan came out, I really was interested to see whether I would see things that are interesting and important for BIPOC frontline communities. So we'll discuss why FEMA is important for environmental justice. We'll discuss a little bit about the executive order. And after my presentation, like my colleague said, we'll have a Q&A, then Hannah, then myself, and then we'll also have a roundtable discussion around the entire webinar. So this is a screenshot of the FEMA's Equity Action Plan. So why is FEMA a key agency for environmental justice? FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and its mission is to help people before and during disasters, right? And we know that climate-related disasters, which include hurricanes and floods, are increasing, right? And that not only are they increasing in terms of how frequently they happened, but also geographically. We also see like new disasters happening in new places like Texas ice storm, winter storm. And we also know that based on the research that BIPOC frontline communities actually have a higher exposure to these kinds of disasters. So the work that FEMA responds to actually really affects BIPOC and frontline communities. And because these communities experience more disasters, we would expect that their role in these communities is important. What we are seeing in the recent research is that, like the research that I mentioned, even though BIPOC frontline communities experience more disasters and as a result more damages, we are seeing that they are not necessarily receiving the most amount of assistance. There's been some disparities in terms of how much assistance they get in different ways that it's being measured. So obviously, because BIPOC frontline communities are experiencing more disasters, this is already an environmental justice issue. But then when you compound federal response and have these inequities, it only exacerbates these future environmental injustices and exacerbates like the conditions in which these communities are more vulnerable and susceptible to disasters. So that's why FEMA's role is so important around environmental justice advocacy, and their equity action plan is something that we really need to take care of and list and like watch out for to make sure that this issue is being addressed. And the citations here I will show at the end. It's peer-reviewed publications, one of which includes my own and my peers. So as you all may have known by now, like the Executive Order 13985 put forward by President Biden's administration is calling for agencies to look at systemic barriers and opportunities to better serve people of color and underserved groups. And a bunch of agencies participated. Our organization, Just Solutions Collective, has a couple of publications around which agencies and how this is important more generally. And specifically for this webinar, FEMA also completed an equity action plan as part of this executive order. And so overall, like a big picture on the equity action plan is that FEMA, what they did is they had 6 different programs, of which they have many, many, many more. So a selection of programs within FEMA went ahead and did an internal evaluation on how they serve people of color and underserved communities and how they can better improve on equity. And these were the 6. The top 3 I'm going to focus on the most because these 3 directly respond to disasters, which is what I started with. But they also have the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which focuses on helping nonprofits increase their security if they're more likely targets of terrorism, etc. The National Flood Insurance, and then the Office of the Chief Component Procurement Officer, which is contracting. So each program submitted about 1.5 to 3 pages of documentation. And also, I forgot to overemphasize, like if you do have questions, I don't want you to hold on to them and forget them. So please feel free to post those questions on the Zoom chat. We're also monitoring the Twitter. So if you have questions there, if you for some reason cannot ask questions on the Zoom chat, ask on Twitter and we'll do our best to answer them. So each organization submitted 1.5 to 3 pages, and they followed a template that they have, which is like they identify barriers to equitable outcomes. Then they outline actions they intend to reduce those barriers, how they're going to track progress, and then how they're being accountable. And so this is their wording. And again, big picture, what we see is that there's a huge variance in terms of understanding about equity by program and even capacity to act on it. So from the get-go, OCCPO mentioned we can't do any of these proposed plans unless there's like a change in the federal acquisition regulation, which is, what controls but how much they can do. And similarly, the National Flood Insurance Program had their proposed equity plan, but also mentioned we can't act on this until our affordability program is approved. So I think it just mentions the need to further not just have the plan, but also do reform around the different policies that affect these programs. So because of that, those caveats will focus mostly on the top three. So I'm just going to quickly check on some in case we have questions already. I don't see any. Okay. So from our perspective, we see those 4 criteria, but we have our own criteria. And the first is, to what extent do these organizations actually specifically identify the BIPOC and frontline communities that the program aims to serve? So because the executive order actually specifically mentioned people of color and underserved groups, we wanted to see the extent into which these programs actually knew what those people were within their programs, instead of being like general and saying that, just having broad statements. And the second one is whether they specifically outline equity actions. And so, there's a difference between ways to improve your program in general, having more registrants, having more money, and then there's specific ones to equity. So we wanted to focus on that. Whether they had relevant measures of equity metrics, and then whether they're planning to outreach and engage underserved groups, whether they had accountability to these underserved groups, and of course, their internal accountability. So just focusing on the first 4, which didn't have those caveats that I mentioned around other policy. We see that this big picture, here's on my left side is the 6 criteria that I just outlined. And on the top is the 4 programs that we're going to review. And in green is the criteria that I think it's reasonably met, and then yellow is weakly met, and then red is not met. And overall, you can see that, for example, public assistance and individual assistance were able to clearly communicate the communities that they aim to serve. And overall, they did, as an overall FEMA programs, they were able to identify at least 2 equity actions, and they had pretty good institutional accountability. That's the criteria number 6. But where they had the most red scores was in identifying 2 or more relevant metrics to keep progress, and then of course having accountability to frontline communities. So that's the big picture. I'm sorry. But let's dig a little bit deeper. And I would say that their strongest programs that really, I think, assess equity best was the Individual Assistance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program. And I think that actually the HMA, so the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, is actually part of the Justice 40 initiative. So it's not surprising that they would have really good criteria met. But another example of relevant equity metrics is allowing for individual assistance, allowing people who are applying to individual assistance to be able to self-certify that they're owners of their homes in different ways that is more flexible. Actually, I'll talk more about that in the next slide. So that's just the big picture. Any questions so far?
Cristina, we have a question in the chat from Sharon Chen about how we make sure that your work is paid for by the government, which I think is a great question, but we might, you let me know, we could save that for the end of your presentation.
Okay, cool. Thank you for flagging that. I just saw that chat. Well, I think the main thing is that I think for me, what's most important is to build those relationships with FEMA. And so that is something that we're doing. We are in communication with their new FEMA equity advisor. And I think it's just part of my job. Like, it's just part of my passion as well, is to make sure that equity is accounted for. So I think that's the way I'm going to answer that question. And then somebody asked, oh, that's a great question. They asked, I'm curious what criteria you may have considered but then discarded. Actually, I don't think I considered more. I feel like 6 was like a good, decent start. But in terms of, I think, especially because this is their equity action plan, it's just, you know, it's supposed to be their first effort. But I think what I really would like to do more is identify, dig deeper into their equity outcomes, because that was the weakest part. And so, in case I didn't make this very clear, what ended up being when I read the entire plan is that instead of it being an actual equity action plan, which implies that it's actionable, and it implies that there's a step-by-step plan to implement it, it really is an internal equity, like, start assessment. It's a preliminary assessment. So there's really not a lot of actionable steps that are outlined in this plan. And as I mentioned, 2 of the 6 programs already said they can't act on it right now based on these different policy restrictions. So it really is more of an internal equity assessment, thoughts, ideas, and it's not a plan, not yet. And so that's one of the biggest things that advocates can kind of like round behind, is like, how are you going to make this an actionable plan? You know, like, and of course, making sure that they're identifying better equity actions and better outcomes and tracking that and having better accountability to BIPOC frontline communities. So I was just going to start into like, what are the good highlights from the program? So I'm going to do that now in this slide. So for public assistance, by the way, public assistance is one of their largest federal response programs. Like, there's public assistance, individual assistance, hazard mitigation, BRIC, etc. And public assistance provides the most amount of dollars. So it's the largest program. And what it does is it provides assistance and aid to state and local governments to improve public infrastructure, like, that has been destroyed. So like, to do rebuilding, reconstruction of public infrastructure, like roads and bridges and electricity, etc., as well as fund some private nonprofits that have public serving capacities. And so it really is aimed for the public, and it's the largest program. And they have 6 actions in total. Not all of them are equity actions, but the top 2 that I think really did the best job at trying to get at this equity is that they have a commitment to develop a process for how recipients and subrecipients report their strategies for equitable response. So what does that even mean? What it means is that right now, federal program has direct contact with the governor, right? Like, the governor makes a disaster declaration, and the state has to do an evaluation of where is the damage based on the disaster, where are the impacts, and then suggest which counties should be eligible for public assistance. And then within those counties, local officials determine which communities, etc., and then it just kind of trickles down. But the most direct relationship is between the governor and the federal program, and then, you know, it's just very hierarchical. And so it's really hard to track how and why some recipients get assistance and others don't. There's the general like eligibility that FEMA provides, but beyond that, it's hard to determine who was even suggested as a possible recipient. And so them saying that there will be a commitment to developing a process for even how sub-recipients report their strategies on how they're going to respond, like how they're going to distribute assistance is pretty significant. And because right now that's not being tracked. For individual assistance, this program is one of the programs that is most relied on by families and individuals. And so a lot of people who've had their homes destroyed, they would be impacted by any changes in the individual assistance program. And they have multiple sub-programs. So they provide assistance to homeowners to do reconstruction of their home. They also provide rental assistance to renters to help them either move to a new housing unit. So they provide like rent stipends. And then they also provide some assistance for properties. So if you have your property destroyed, like personal property, there's other programs too within individual assistance. And so this program had 21 actions. Again, not all 21 were specifically equity ones, but the ones that are highlighted here that I thought were the best were to allow, like I was saying, the self-certification of ownership, especially for mobile homes and for heirship property. So that is like one of the biggest challenges has been people being able to prove that they're homeowners, that will allow them to become eligible for individual assistance. And you know, if you are flooded and your paperwork gets flooded, like it's definitely challenging to prove that. In Puerto Rico, we know that the way that home ownership is established is less formal, so they might not have the same kind of documentation that FEMA has come to expect. And they're still having this issue in Puerto Rico, but at the very least, they're starting to change this language. And I really think that we just need to keep informing the extent to which it's been successfully implemented or not. And so expanding ownership is definitely going to be helpful, especially for BIPOC frontline communities, because as I mentioned, in Puerto Rico, it's less formal. Here in the mainland as well, what happens is that a lot of immigrant and Latino and communities of color, they just tend to informally inherit property, or multiple families live in the same property. And so you could have 3 different head of households technically in the same home, but only one family would be eligible. And so that definitely affects our communities. And then finally, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program provides assistance to communities to implement mitigation in the disaster recovery aspect. So like when you're recovering from a disaster, how can you implement mitigation? Such as flood walls, or even just establishing other kinds of policies that help reduce future disaster impacts. And they outline 16 actions, not all of them equity actions. But specifically, they wanted to provide technical assistance to underserved communities. And this is definitely notable. And I feel like that was one of the questions that we got in the registration. When you were registering, somebody asked about support for underserved communities. And so the hazard mitigation assistance is proposing to provide technical assistance. I believe individual assistance already has technical assistance providing that. And so this one for the hazard mitigation assistance would be great, especially if they did a full cycle. So I think they have more language to work through. But right now, to be eligible for the hazard mitigation assistance program, so to implement mitigation, you had to already have a mitigation plan. So before that, your community has to have a plan on how they would implement mitigation before you're eligible for the money to implement it, which makes sense. It's just planning, right? You plan something, then you implement. However, the problem is that BIPOC frontline communities, rural communities, and low-income communities might not have those planning division departments, might not have the resources to develop a plan to begin with, even if they're really in need of mitigation assistance dollars. So doing a full cycle technical assistance would be really helpful so that these communities are eligible for hazard mitigation assistance and get the support that they need to develop those plans. And yeah. Is there any other questions? Okay, so almost done here. Basically, so that's what the specific programs, and overall, in terms of policy recommendations, and I'm excited that Hannah is presenting after the Q&A, because one of the first recommendations is just the way that the equity was defined, or at least highlighted within the equity action plan, was more broad and general than I think they could do by leveraging the Stafford Act's non-discrimination clause. And even the National Advisory Council, which is a legislative, it's like, it's in the law, like there's the National Advisory Council, it's a committee of external stakeholders that provide advice to FEMA. And in their 2020 report, they came up with this amazing definition for equity that they had workshopped the entire year. And it really does, I feel like it really does straight out outline like equity is not the same as equality, and why is that important, and the importance of making sure that communities in higher need receive the most assistance. And that language was really missing in the equity action plan. It wasn't as strong as the one that was recommended by the National Advisory Council. And especially did not include language around low income and poverty. So that's some area to improve on. And then of course, the measuring equity outcomes, which I realized I didn't focus too much on, but example of the outcomes that they say they were measuring. For example, for public assistance, they said, we're going to increase percentage of reports that are acceptable. So that's their equity outcome. It's very, very broad, obviously, and it doesn't even say anything about whether it's BIPOC focused, equity focused. It's just acceptable. For individual assistance, they did have two general outcome measures, which I think are more like success metrics. For example, an increased percentage of ownership verification. Even though I mentioned that ownership verification is really important, it doesn't specifically say ownership verification for low-income communities, for multiple families in the household. You know, it just says increased percentage. So it's really broad. HMA was the only one that had really two good ones. And that one was increased applicants from underserved communities. So there's a count, a number of how many applicants that they're getting, although it doesn't say necessarily approved applicants, it just says increased applicants. And then 40% of the benefits of the program will go to disadvantaged communities. So that's dollar amount. That's very significant. Again, they're part of the Justice 40 initiative. So these are examples of effective equity outcomes, and HMA was the only one who really identified them. The nonprofit security grant program just said identify underrepresented communities with GIS analysis. There's no identification of what they're going to do with that information, and we know that GIS analysis is just really broad. It's not engaging. It's not really you know, it's just really broad. So so there's definitely area for improvement in that, and it's important for them to identify like what those progress is, because that's going to help advocates be able to say, hey, you're tracking the number of applicants, like how is that number increasing for BIPOC communities? Or, you know, like if we know what they're tracking, then we can hold them accountable to it. And if they're tracking something so general that's not equity based, then there's that lack of leverage. And there has to be equity outcomes if it's trying to do that in the equity action plan. So yeah, they should improve their equity measures. And like I said, there's lack of accountability to BIPOC frontline communities. And even when it says that equity will be evaluated, whether it will be enforced is another thing, and then whether there'll be any consequences for lack of equity progress. It's not really well known. So that is that. And then here's the three citations that I said at the beginning for how, in this example, public assistance, and then individual assistance is the second one, and the third one is the HMA program, how these three different programs have not served BIPOC-friendly communities by peer review publications and academic scholars. So that's the summary of what I just mentioned, and I'm here to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Awesome. Great presentation, Cristina. Thank you. If you're in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat to ask questions. You can also raise your hand if you'd like us to unmute you, and you can ask your question live. One question that we do have in the Q&A box is around how you define equity. And so if you can share a little bit more about that.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I really am basing it based on the National Advisory Council's definition of equity, because there are FEMA's advisory council and they know the program very well. And as I mentioned, what they highlighted was basically making sure that communities of color, low-income communities, rural communities who are who have the least capacity to recover from disasters and who are most exposed receive the most assistance. And so equity in this sense is having those with greater needs get more assistance. And they specifically mention it's not the same as equality and why giving equal assistance to everyone isn't equitable. And the reason why is because if we have a community with a lot of resources and one with less, and you give them both the same amount of assistance, there's already research that shows that if the goal of FEMA is to help communities achieve their own recovery, so they have to support their recovery, but FEMA is supporting that, right, supplementing it. The community with less assistance isn't going to achieve that outcome. So it doesn't matter that they got FEMA assistance if the outcome is not achieved. And so the only way to really help those communities achieve their recovery outcomes is by providing the assistance that they need, which is greater.
That's great. Awesome. Thanks for that. Another question just came in. Let's see. Where do you see opportunities for community organizations to act and inform FEMA about their experience, and what is necessary to change FEMA systems? So
I think there's one that is already existing, and then there's another one that I think that they're working on. So one of them is just the way that all the agencies have been getting public comments through their requests for information, like the federal registry. So I will say the new FEMA administrator who once served in the National Advisory Council is producing a lot of new changes, and they recently published FEMA's strategic plan, and they have 3 specific outcomes in that strategic plan, one of which is equity. So I think that they are informing themselves, and they have the National Advisory Council, but where they're lacking is being accessible to feedback from BIPOC-friendly communities, especially community-based organizations, right? Like they're expecting us to come to them. And so there's a couple of ways. One is there's the, and I'm gonna, after I say my answer, I'm gonna do my best to share the links because I cannot multitask. But one way is to be part of the National Advisory Council. They write reports each year and make recommendations. And the most recent last 2, I feel like they were really heard. I attended their National Advisory Council workshop this last month, and the administrator responded to it. So I'll provide a link to that, like how to register for it. And there's a huge application process. So I don't know if you will get it or not, but that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is, again, the federal registration. They ask questions. They had a question session for this FEMA Equity Action Plan. The problem there is, like, again, they're expecting us to come to them. It's only open 30 days and it's not really well advertised. So it's something that you guys will have to keep track of. So I'm going to share that link. And then the new thing that I'm hoping is going to be happening is, because of the Justice 40 initiative, HMA and BRIC, and I believe there's like 2 other programs that they've mentioned, are going to be participating in Justice 40. And so I believe as part of Justice 40, they're going to have to do more engagement and more outreach, and hopefully provide new mechanisms for holding them accountable. And so keep an eye on that, definitely follow it. And so I'll also provide a link to that. And then, yeah, and then hopefully also through us, like, as I mentioned, we are building relationships with FEMA, with the equity advisor. I will be presenting to the National Advisory Council next year. And so that's what Just Solutions Collective is here for, is to help also like facilitate that space, be the bridge in between. So if there's anything I can do or we can do to support you in your advocacy with research policy, or like establishing a discussion space, please let us know.
Can I add one thing? I came off camera. I guess 2 things. One, Cristina mentioned the agency's request for comment. So we have a federal environmental justice tracker on our website, and I'm going to post the link in the chat to our FEMA page. And up at the top, you'll see a public participation drop down. So we try to put any new opportunities where FEMA is soliciting public comment on that page. So hopefully that gives you a one-stop shop where you can look at what the public participation opportunities are. And then we also have a primer on agency rulemakings and what that looks like, and where are the ways that you can influence the agency. So those are public resources that are available to you all. The other recommendation I wanted to give is a little counterintuitive, but the way that federal disaster assistance gets spent or triggered is it starts with the states. And so going through your state, it might be the Department of Homeland Security, it might be emergency management, with the caveat that I recognize some state governments are more open to these conversations than others. But starting with your state government now before a disaster and letting them know we are here, these are our particularized needs, these are the ways that we want to be consulted before, during, and after a disaster. Those are really important conversations to have now before disasters strike, when people have less capacity. So I just wanted to flag the states because they play such a crucial role in federal response. And oftentimes FEMA will say, well, we can't do that because the state didn't ask for it. So states.
Thanks for that, Hannah. We have a question from Selena. I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question, Selena. I can also ask it.
Sure. Yeah, I can ask. Thank you all for holding this space. My question is, have you, the Just Solutions Collective, completed some sort of mapping exercise of decision makers and influencers within FEMA? And I ask this because I'm with the Energy Democracy Project, and we work with a bunch of organizations across the country that are really hoping to get their messages in front of those power holders within FEMA who might be most likely having the power to enact change.
That's a great question. We have not. We do have something planned out though. We are working on like creating a flow chart for how assistance is like triggered and how it's trickled down. And in that flow chart, we will identify like who are the people in that process, but not necessarily in terms of power holders for changing policy. So that's something to keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, I want to keep us moving forward. So we're going to have Hannah do her presentation. And if anyone else has other questions for Cristina, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those. So I'll pass it on to you, Hannah.
Great. I will see if I can share my screen. All right. Here we go. All right. Are y'all seeing the slideshow?
Yes.
Great. All right. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much to the Just Solutions Collective for inviting me. and really excited about the analysis that Cristina provided. And my hope is that this presentation will build off of that and help answer some of y'all's questions about advocacy opportunities. My perspective is I am a lawyer by training. I also have a human rights background focused on displacement in Central America. Came to law school to be able to build out my legal understanding for how to address disaster displacement in the United States, which inevitably brings me to FEMA. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a bit about who we are, the Environmental Energy Law Program, and the type of work that we do. And then this presentation is really about FEMA's authority and the laws that it operates under, and whether or not it has the authority and the discretion to implement many of the changes that BIPOC communities and other advocates are calling for to make its programs more equitable. And I'll end with tools for advocates. So what does this research mean? How do you integrate it? How do you talk to FEMA in a way that might be more persuasive in terms of its legal obligations, things like that. And as Cristina mentioned in her presentation, please put stuff in the chat or interrupt me if you have any questions. And I'm just reading Paul's piece in the chat. I don't want to miss anything. Should we go directly to someone at these agencies, or is there someone at FEMA that can help us make these connections? Is there a particular FEMA division we should engage? It's a great question. Need assistance with BIPOC outreach and future program equity. Okay. So maybe if it's all right with you, I want to save those questions till the end because I think it's part of a broader conversation around advocacy strategy. And I think there are multiple people, including the panelists who have joined, who have more expertise in that area. So I'll try to move through my stuff quickly so we can get to those questions. All right. Oh, too fast. So in short, what is the Environmental and Energy Law Program? We are a legal research center based at Harvard Law School. So we are not a clinic. We don't have attorney-client relationships. We instead work on more forward-looking legal analysis and bringing people together to advance what we call durable regulation and policy, meaning rules and policy solutions that will withstand judicial review, lawsuits, and also changes in administration, right? There's often this massive change that happens when someone new enters the White House, and that makes it really hard to achieve longstanding change. And so how do we design policies that are going to cut through all of that and really help people over the long term? And we use that strategy over a range of portfolios. We look at climate, environment, and public health regulations, electricity law and energy, which is more about FERC and transmission, state and regional climate strategies like decarbonization in various sectors, corporate climate disclosures. Should companies be required to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we do that? But the portfolio that I head up is our environmental justice and equity portfolio. And within that, we focus on federal environmental justice policy. So all of the initiatives under the Biden administration focused on environmental justice and equity, and then specifically equitable disaster preparedness and response. So really looking at FEMA and other agencies that have a role in preparedness, response, and recovery. And how do we help them integrate equity into those programs? All right. So jumping right in, Cristina mentioned Executive Order 13985. That's the Racial Equity Executive Order. She also mentioned the request for information, those calls for information that the agency puts out. And so in April of 2021, consistent with this executive order, FEMA put out this RFI, this request for information, saying, we want you to tell us how we can do better on equity. And specifically, they solicited input to help FEMA ensure that its programs further the goals of advancing equity for all, including those in underserved communities, bolstering resilience from the impacts of climate change, and particularly for those disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental justice. So lots of commas, lots of caveats. But I just wanted to emphasize how extraordinary this is within the history of FEMA. FEMA generally identifies as an emergency response organization. You've got a lot of EMTs, a lot of military, a lot of veterans. That hasn't been an equity-centered organization. And so to have this come out of FEMA is really a marker of the Biden administration's focus on a whole of government approach to equity and environmental justice rather than just EPA, which is how the federal government has historically looked at that issue. So I just wanted to flag how novel this is, and a really unique opportunity to tell the government how to do better. So in response to that RFI, and by the way, if you want to look through all the comments, there was a robust response. Over 300 folks commented. Many of the folks on this call commented, and this is the docket number. So if you've never used regulations.gov before, it's essentially a place to look up all of the rulemaking activities that federal agencies engage in, including all of the comments that people have submitted. And so if you want to go back and see what people said, you can go to regulations.gov and you search that docket number, and then you can look at everything, which is kind of spiffy. All right. So a quick note on agency authority. And I wanted to do this because when we think about all of those comments that were submitted, as a lawyer, my next question is, these are all fantastic suggestions, but the question the agency is going to be asking is, do we even have the authority to do any of this? And so I just wanted to quickly explain how statutory authority works for folks who might be new to this concept. So in general, federal agencies do not have unlimited power or discretion to do whatever they want. Well, so here I've got a little imagery. I'm a big fan of pictures, and I have a small kid, so she appreciates this. But federal agencies, here's our little puppy. They are restricted in how much they can do by laws or statutes that are passed by Congress, which you could think of as sort of a combination of a leash and a bunch of dog food, right? How much power do they have? How much food do they get? And how constrained are they, right? How narrow is that scope of authority in the laws that are passed? And then courts also play a role in interpreting those laws, and they decide when agencies have acted in a way that exceeds the authority that Congress gave it. So when did they go beyond their leash? When did they do more than they were supposed to? And so again, we have our dog owner here, where Congress will delegate power through laws, and courts will review agency actions and potentially, wrap them on the wrist and say, no, you did more than you were supposed to. Shouldn't that have been impacted by climate change and environmental? I thought about that. I can go back. The commas are weirdly placed, so there was a whole bracket. Further the goal of advancing equity for all, giant comma, and then furthering the goal of environmental justice. But it's very poorly written. So Alice, I agree with you. All right. So this is the question that I researched as a lawyer. Does FEMA have the legal authority to integrate equity into its programs? Essentially, how long is its leash? How much power has Congress given it? And when courts have interpreted FEMA's actions under that law, are they really, really skeptical of the agency's authority? Are they really picking apart and being very, what do I want to say? Are they cabining the agency's authority and wrapping them on the wrist a lot? Or are they saying, nope, you do you, we trust you, go forth, do what you want? So this comes down to a provision that Cristina mentioned, the non-discrimination provision under something called the Stafford Act. The Robert T. Stafford Act is the primary law under which FEMA operates and most disaster programs are administered. There's other laws and other agencies that are involved, but we're really focusing on FEMA because they tend to be the lead agency in so much of the less preparedness, but getting to be more involved in preparedness, but primarily the relief and short-term recovery efforts. So under this provision, what we found when we really dug into the text, the case law, the legislative history, they have a lot of power. There is a lot of power delegated to FEMA to integrate equity, think about equity, and make sure its programs don't exacerbate inequities. So a lot of power, a lot of dog food. And they have an incredibly long leash. Courts really don't want to second guess FEMA because of its role in this emergency response area. So that's all good news. This is a lot of text, I apologize, but I just wanted to emphasize how extraordinary this provision is in the context of federal non-discrimination law writ large. So this provision, if you want to nerd out with me, it's 42 USC, which is US Code 5151, section 5151. And the first part says that the president must issue regulations implementing this provision such that disaster activities are accomplished in an equitable and impartial manner. As a lawyer, I saw that and I was like, that is bananas language. That is incredible language to see in a federal statute. An equitable and impartial manner without discrimination on the grounds of race, color, religion, nationality, sex, age, disability, English proficiency, or economic status. And again, if you're my fellow civil rights nerds on the call, we see a lot of federal law prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of race, color, ethnicity, national origin, language proficiency, disability. But to see age and economic status in there and sex all in the same pool is really extraordinary in terms of the scope. We call these protected classes. The number and scope of protected classes in this provision is really amazing. Great. Someone's posting some really great links in the, oh, Cristina, thank you for posting those links in the chat. The second part, I know it's more text, but I really wanted to include this second part because Congress wanted to make sure that it wasn't just FEMA that was held to account for not discriminating, but also private agencies and entities that help administer federal assistance. And in particular, they were concerned about the American Red Cross at this moment in time. And so as a condition of helping distribute assistance or supplies under the Stafford Act, so maybe you get funding from the federal government and you help in the disaster response, governmental bodies, so states, localities, other federal agencies, and other organizations, so think American Red Cross, shall be required to comply with those regulations. So these same big, bold non-discrimination prohibitions apply to those other people too. All right. I can't let go of the dog in the leash. So again, these are our findings, and it's a lot of text, but I just wanted to hammer this home. What we found is that this non-discrimination provision, what I had on the previous slide, gives FEMA really broad statutory authority, right? So sort of Congress handing over power to the agency to redesign its programs in an equitable and impartial manner, that's from the law, including reforming programs that currently disproportionately exclude low-income communities and communities of color. So it's not just about combating instances of intentional discrimination where FEMA says, oh, this is a majority Black community, and for that reason, we're not going to give them as much money, right? That would be a really egregious example of intentional discrimination. And yes, that's prohibited. But when we dug into the history of how this provision came to be, it's also about prohibiting unintended disparate impacts on those protected groups. And so I think that's really where the power of this provision comes from. The second piece I wanted to emphasize is that really long leash, right? Where courts say, we're not going to touch it, FEMA, do what you want. And this is under something called the discretionary function exception. This is why people don't like lawyers sometimes, as we use too many words, but the idea of the discretionary function exception is that it's an extra shield, an immunity shield around FEMA, protecting them from suit. And the idea is that courts have really interpreted this provision broadly because they don't want FEMA to be worried about getting sued. You can sue FEMA, and a court will most likely say, you know what, we're not going to second guess FEMA. We're not even going to look at the matter at issue because this is a question of discretion. And when it's FEMA using its discretion, we don't want to second guess them because they're doing a really important job. They're responding in the spur of the moment, and we don't want to second guess that. So case closed, which is really amazing. I think if you're at EPA, you're looking over at FEMA going, dang, I would really like that amount of discretion. That would be really nice because courts are very skeptical of EPA right now. And so FEMA is really unique in this sense, and it gives them a lot of wiggle room to interpret their laws in new ways. So before I get to the downside, I wanted to flag why this is so important in the equity context. What this means is for advocates, we can go to FEMA and say, you have not only the authority to do things differently and to really look at how to make your programs more equitable, but when you do that, you're protected, right? Even if people sue, courts are really unlikely to second guess you because of this discretionary function exception that's baked specifically into the Stafford Act. We have a report on this. We can provide language on this, but I just wanted to clarify why that's relevant to advocates. There's a downside. What all of that that long leash, the downside of that is that there's limited legal accountability. So if someone wants to sue FEMA for discriminating, right? Let's say there's a wealthy white community that receives proportionally a much larger share of federal disaster assistance than a low-income community of color. In order to successfully sue FEMA, you have to prove that that was intentional. And this is the same standard under suits under the Equal Protection Clause or Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The other challenge that's unique to disasters is that you have to be able to separate out the effects of the disaster versus the effects of the federal agency's actions. And this is a long quote, but I include it from a federal court in the Eastern District of Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. And this was a group of Black Americans who sued the federal government for their response to Hurricane Katrina, which many of us know is just egregiously neglectful and in some cases overtly harmful, particularly with regard to Black Americans living in this area. And what the court said is FEMA argues that people who are economically disadvantaged will always what did I do? Sorry about that. Will always be more in need of federal disaster assistance. And this inevitable fact does not mean that FEMA's actions violate any discriminatory prohibition. The court agrees FEMA's handling of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina was unorganized, highly bureaucratic, and detached, but inevitably, those with economic resources will recover more quickly than those without. So what the court is saying is, you know what? Yeah, what the federal government did was inadequate and kind of sucked, but that's just how disasters are. And it makes that analysis, that perspective makes it really hard if you want to sue FEMA, because you have to say what happened wasn't the disaster. This was a consequence of what FEMA did. And so it raises the bar even higher. The last thing I'll say, and this is more for my fellow lawyers out there, there's something called the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and this prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, and national origin, and also includes language access. And there's an administrative complaint process, so you can file a complaint with FEMA saying that your state administered disaster assistance in a way that disproportionately impacted you. So you don't need that intent piece anymore, but it has to go through FEMA. And a lot of other agencies are becoming much more transparent and active on Title VI complaints right now, HUD, EPA, but FEMA continues to be a black box. We don't know anything about FEMA or the Department of Homeland Security's Title VI process. I know folks on this call have submitted Title VI complaints and heard nothing. And so it would be great if anyone on the call has more information about that, but really pushing to get FEMA to be more active and transparent about its Title VI complaint process. All right, punchline, what does this mean for advocates? Essentially, what I've found in particular with FEMA is that there are certain ways that things have always been done, right? There's ways that policies and laws have been interpreted, and that's just the way it is. But what we know from, right, all that dog food, the amount of power Congress has given them under the non-discrimination provision, that long leash, that's not the way it has to be. There are ways where FEMA could reinterpret what it's doing and impose new policies, and they can do that very quickly, right? So they have a lot of flexibility, a lot of discretion. When you're talking to FEMA and you want to make the case that they should do things differently, it's really important to do their work for them and explain why what they're doing is consistent with their legal authority, right? Because otherwise you might have an agency that's like, well, you know, that sounds great, but we don't have the power to do that and we don't want to get in trouble. And Cristina mentioned this with the affordability program and the national flood insurance policies. FEMA's like, you know, it'd be great if we made this more affordable, but we need Congress to pass an affordability program, right? That's kind of an example of that argument in action. So when you talk to FEMA and you're putting forward a proposal, it's important to say why they have the legal authority to do that thing and emphasize that if they do that thing, courts are really unlikely to second folks helping FEMA. I don't know if y'all, my internet is unstable again, but
We can hear you.
okay, great, thank you. You'd think Harvard would have better internet. Anyway, to not lose sight of the state
We lost Hannah again. So, but as she's finishing up, please feel free to post your questions for Hannah, as well as just general questions for the webinar. We're gonna open the roundtable discussion pretty soon.
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Basically, don't lose sight of states and municipalities and private entities that are engaged in this work, because they're on the legal hook too, and they have less of an immunity shield than FEMA does. All right, and then just some resources. We're here to help. If you need legal language to bolster your comment, shoot me an email. There's my email. I mentioned our EJ tracker page. We have resources there. We're following what FEMA's doing and internal policy changes that they're making also on that page. And then if you need citations, the report where we talk about the dog food and the leash is this first one. And then we have a broader piece about the federal disaster program and how that translates into discrimination in that second one. So I'll be quiet with that. I'm all done, and would love to hear what you all think. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Hannah. As Cristina mentioned, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A box. And our panelists, you should have the ability to unmute and turn on your video. And if you're in the audience, you have the ability to raise your hand and we can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question live. So I'll turn it over to you, Cristina.
Thank you. So, yeah, and then how can they know if they're inside for unmuting themselves or outside? I guess I got a question.
Yeah, if you are able to, if you're on the panel, if you can see the word panelist at the top of your screen, you know that you are able to unmute yourself on your own. If you can't see it, then you'll need to raise your hand and then we can give you the ability to unmute.
Great, thank you so much. So yes, so while people are thinking of their question, and again, you are free to unmute at this point, but while people are thinking about their questions and starting, we want you to ask us like how we can help you. We want you to like talk about what you've been trying to do, what like how you're building resilience and justice, environmental justice into your program for disasters. So we want to hear all about that. And also if you can answer these questions on Twitter. So how is the organization building disaster resilience or equity in your program? So like show off what you're doing. You guys are all doing amazing stuff. That's why you're here. You want to know more. So let us know what you're doing right now and how would an effective equity program help your community? So because there's different ways that it impacts our community. So please feel free to do that on Twitter and use the hashtag JustSolutionsCollectiveEquityFEMA. All right, so I'm gonna mute myself so you guys can unmute.
I'll go ahead and open up. Sometimes it takes a little to break the ice. My name is Paul Tabioyan. I'm from Yakima, Washington. I'm part of the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition. We are an API group that works really collectively with our BIPOC community here in central Washington state. And I've actually been FEMA trained for years as part of our local search and rescue department. And having kind of separated that from the actual, like search and rescue activities and getting into the actual nonprofit side of emergency preparedness, we took a chance in one of our programs to reach out to our local emergency preparedness group. And what we immediately realized, and that was my comment earlier, was that we actually realized that they were just in the process of getting state and federal funding for their emergency preparedness programs, for housing some of the emergency goods. And this is, people don't think like central Washington state, how can, this is kind of the middle of the desert, what emergency would we have? But we're actually preparing for the Nisqually earthquake. So, we know San Francisco, Los Angeles, when they have earthquakes, it damages a large amount of infrastructure. So we know that can happen here in Washington, all the way from the West Coast right down through the center of the state. Initially, the FEMA organization was a community-based organization. They had donation funding. They didn't really apply for grants. And now the new collective group realizes that this is kind of a more modern approach of our local entities that work with our city and state governments, because often the funding is not there. So I can honestly say, you know, we are, I want to say almost 50% Latino community. We've seen the diversity of programs and lack of access. And this is one of those, I guess you could say, state to federal programs that really hasn't kept up with the times because of some of the local involvement of the people who actually operate the systems. So status quo, status quo. And we recognize that, and we were actually, they actually did reach out to our community organization because we did a lot of advertising on television through census and redistricting, which meant we're really not afraid to become a public entity, where some nonprofits kind of, you know, they skate that border of, do we want to go too big? Does that acknowledgement mean, you know, actual physical issues in the day and age of some of the anti-Asian hate movements? You know, that's an actual real concern. You know, they'll damage our building, things of that nature. But we're willing to take that step, and we immediately identified that, wow, they actually have a very, very small, if in anything, non-existent outreach program, even in a community of 250,000. We've had floods, we've had other issues, but the city and the state governments chose to separate themselves from the federal side. So what we had was a local community that said, we're going to create our own emergency preparedness. And of course that failed. So now we're having to rebuild it literally because of COVID. And our organization chose to be part of that. Even though we're very small, we have the ability to do marketing, advertising, and then assist with the volunteer issues that a lot of these organizations have. That's the first thing that we identified was in their outreach programs, these are people that are actually working first responders. So as soon as there's a response, they're no longer at the event. They pack up and they leave. And that could be literally 10 minutes. And the stories we're proven that, you know, half hour into the event, we had to leave because of this huge fire, or we had wildfires. So community engagement is needing to become a collaborative event with our local nonprofits and an educational process. And we identified that and realized that we could help supplement some of those costs by utilizing our network to begin to receive their materials, which we haven't initially gotten, you know, physical materials yet, but come the spring, that's one of the projects, is receiving the materials from their group. And what I would ask from this group is how do the larger FEMA communications information actually reach the smaller state to county entities? Because that's basically what we're dealing with, is the county level. The city level is organized through the county level. And that's really where it starts, because we have so many different geographical regions. But what we find is, you know, I'm actually a systems analyst. So that was my first question, is how does that information get here? And I found that there's basically some serious roadblocks in it. And I don't know if that's whether the education, like this program, educating the individuals more of the state programs to reach to the counties, or if there is just, you know, this is the development of the communications network that would actually create that pipeline of information. And I would say, you know, Census as a 1 to 10 year entity, their organization did a great job in disseminating the information in a short period of time. As a federal agency, I don't know how you can compare those programs or systems, because I do know that, you know, FEMA operates, they all operate in such different capacities.
Yeah, one of the recommendations we definitely had for engaging community-based organizations, like you mentioned, like, you know, people might come and then leave, but community-based organizations, they are part of the community. They know who they're serving. They have those established relationships. And so one of the recommendations within the policy brief is for these agencies to actually provide technical assistance, financial assistance, and build direct relationships with the nonprofits who genuinely are doing that work already. They're just not getting recognized, not getting the support, and they're not having the leverage to inform back and be able to say, like, this is what we found from our experience, you know, facilitating and helping our communities recover, we have a bunch of groups here and the panelists who are CBOs, serving Latino communities, and other organizations. If you guys wanted to mention like what kind of work you've been doing and how we can help you leverage this information for your work.
I'll just add a quick short. Is the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition of Yakima. Our goal is to get involved and be one of the volunteer groups that will kind of encourage other groups, like the Latino groups. Why? Because we do have different demographics of community, but in being in those positions, we can also help the community realize that then they'll have an access point for other issues as well. So combining forces, not only in communication of education to the community, this is a great, initial point, because when you're dealing with the first responders, you always get great rapport. And that was one of the other reasons we chose to work with the group, our local LEPC, was that they knew that we were great communicators to the community, and we would hope that they would learn from us, we would learn from them, and then it comes a greater collaborative information process.
Thank you. So I think one of the questions we got earlier is like different ways that we can be involved. And I think one of the things is definitely, as Hannah mentioned, like building those relationships with the state officials. And another one is through BOADs. So build like, the volunteer, what was BOADs, like volunteered organizations active in disasters, I think that's just BOADs.
It's the moment when you realize you only speak in acronyms and you have no idea what they stand for. Volunteer organizations, active in disaster.
Yeah. And so it tends to be mostly emergency management, disaster response organizations. But one of the things that would be great is if we have, general community-based organizations, whether it's in environmental justice and public health and, food access, like if they're part of the same team, like Paul mentioned, like disasters exacerbate existing inequalities. That's food access, water access, like anything that is already an EJ issue, disasters tend to exacerbate. So we have advocates who are working on these issues in a table around disaster response with, again, the caveat that you guys get funded, technical assistance supported, you have that power. But if you're able to be in that table, you can inform a better response and recovery because you already know the issues in your community best. So yeah, if there's any other questions, let us know, and I'll have Taylor give me a time check. I want to know how we're doing with time.
Yeah, we're kind of nearing the end of time. So if there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in now. I'm also going to share the link to our post-event survey. So if you don't have time to ask your question now, you can ask it on there and we can get back to you about your question and answer it in our follow-up materials. So maybe to end, if there's anything, we have a hand raised from Selena.
Yeah, hi again. So as I mentioned before, I'm with the Energy Democracy Project, and we currently have a campaign that's meant to tie the narrative threads together of the energy justice movement from Alaska to Puerto Rico, and also amplify some of the calls to action that are coming from activists directly in Puerto Rico. And so I'm really excited by this information because I feel like there's some potential nodes for us to start to think about moving from a policy perspective. And I guess off the top of your head, in understanding the current landscape of FEMA's involvement in Puerto Rico and of some of the potential legal avenues that we might be able to leverage, what might come to mind for you as points of intervention?
Yeah.
All right. I have so many thoughts. I'll keep them short. One, I think there are a number of folks who are actively thinking through these avenues. The one that comes to mind is the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and they have a disaster housing recovery work group. Noah Patton heads that up. And so they're thinking that through in partnership with Ayuda Legal in Puerto Rico. I think it's important to start from the harm that you want to address. So language access has obviously been a massive issue in the response after Hurricane Maria, both for Spanish speakers and folks who require sign. And so that would be a Title VI issue. I think there's also opportunities for across the country advocacy because language access. No worries. Language access is consistently an issue across the country. And so I also think having these places for all of us to come back together and compare notes provides opportunity to then use those stories as part of a coherent narrative and request for change. And so just to summarize, I think connecting with other advocates who are thinking about this nationally, and the reason I flagged NOAA is that they're also thinking through legislative proposals. So marrying what the experiences are of frontline communities with legislative proposals that are currently moving to address the Stafford Act and other FEMA related issues. What harm do you want to fix and redress? And then that will lead you, NOAA patent, to the different legal tools that are available. And we're definitely available as you think that through. If you want to chat with a lawyer, we're available for that.
Yeah, on top of the language access, and like Hannah mentioned, sign language and in Spanish, right? It's important. I did mention that even though they've recently passed, like more different ways of verifying your home ownership, it's still a big issue in Puerto Rico. That's another one. And I think just communication. Another one is actually, we know that Puerto Rico has a massive energy crisis. Like energy cost is super high in Puerto Rico. We have a blog from one of our colleagues recently. Suli Juarez has published something recently around that. So we know that energy is super expensive, it's super unreliable. There's blackouts that last weeks to months, especially after a disaster. And yet FEMA is supporting creating a more resilient energy infrastructure that is still based on fossil fuels, that is still based on this just failing infrastructure. And especially the way that it's there, it's like privatized, it's monopolized. So, it would be a great time to implement solar energy, wind energy, more renewable resources that are not only just renewable, but also it's community owned, so it's not monopolized. So some of our partners like Casa Pueblo, in Puerto Rico have a great example of a community-owned microgrid solar energy project that has been able to sustain hurricanes and be able to continue to provide energy to their to residents, especially those that are in need of medical supplies that require electricity. So, I think that's a huge missed opportunity for FEMA to actually work with communities, provide real resilient energy infrastructure that is community owned, and it's better for the environment.
Thank you both. Yeah, excited to keep in touch and tap some more of your expertise. And I'll also drop in the chat for other folks who are on the call just the link to the campaign that the project is leading. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Really enjoyed this conversation. We are going to follow up with some materials. We'll reshare all the links that were shared in the chat. I'll include that in the follow-up email so you have that all in one place, and share with you ways to get in contact with us. If you'd like to stay connected on federal policy work, we do have a federal policy specific listserv. So you can sign up for that, and we'll send you emails on ways that you can engage in federal policy more broadly. And with that, I will close out. Thank you to Cristina and Hannah for your expertise, and thanks to our panelists for joining the conversation. And we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.